We'll just do a quick introduction and we'll dive right in. My name is Susan Corwith, and I'm an Associate Director here at the Center for Talent Development, which is part of the School of Education and Social Policy here at Northwestern. I've been here about 13 years working in program development and design, assessment, and school services, which includes sort of professional learning and outreach and working in partnership with schools. Prior to that, I spent some years in the classroom as a gifted program coordinator, a classroom teacher, and reading specialist.
And my name is Melissa Shaw, and I am the assessment coordinator here at Center for Talent Development. I've been here about a year and a half now. Came directly from an assessment-specific world in education, but I've also, over the last 30 years, been a consultant, a school administrator, and a classroom teacher as well.
So we'll go ahead and dive right in, if we can. There we go. Today our presentation is really built around three focus questions that we think are critical for educators and school leaders to address if we want all of our students to reach their full potential. And these questions are, how effectively is our system finding all advanced or high ability learners? And I think, we've learned from our experience in the research, we aren't finding them all, in the different contexts of our schools and school buildings. And we can do better. So how well are we providing programming for these learners when we do find them? And then are we able to demonstrate growth commensurate with ability? And that's a question that's become even more important in the state of Illinois as we've moved away from growth to proficiency to sort of trying to measure true growth for all of our students. So we start with sort of an educational philosophy, and all of our recommendations today are related to the focus questions and are grounded in specific ideas or perspectives about education. And this first idea is optimal match. And this is not a gifted education philosophy, it's a philosophy for all learners. And it's a simple idea that educators recognize the learning and developmental differences in their students and provide curriculum that's aligned to their cognitive and affective needs. So in other words, we want to create an environment where all students are able to learn and grow optimally. It's such a simple idea, but we know the implementation is much more complex. And the approach we're using to create an optimal match learning environment, given the center that we sit in, is about talent development. We're at the Center for Talent Development. That's the work we do here, but there's a framework behind that. And in this approach, when we talk about gifted or advanced, it's always relative to other high-performing individuals within a domain of talent. So the goal of talent development is to identify and then translate exceptional ability into actual achievement. And we know that programming and psychosocial skill development help students move their talent through different stages. And that's what you see here on the screen are these stages. And as individuals mature, achievement becomes increasingly important to defining what we call giftedness. In adulthood, when we call someone a gifted writer or a gifted scientist, that's really based on demonstrated production, creative production, relative to other writers or scientists. But in that talent development perspective, achievement doesn't necessarily have to be in school. It can also be products and performances generated outside of school. But when we look at the K-12 system, there are three sort of key stages of development around which we put together services for students. And this timeline, you see early childhood to late adolescence. It's not as fixed as it seems, but it's a reference point for K-12. So emergent talent is really where young people are engaging in exploration, and we as teachers and administrators are talent miners. We're looking for what students can know and understand and can do and what they tell us about their learning and their readiness. And so we're providing enrichment and fundamental skills that we hope will then move them into competence, or that competency stage, which is where we're really focusing on developing core knowledge and skills, but still through enrichment and acceleration, particularly in their talent areas, where they're showing us they have exceptional strengths or really strong interests. And then ultimately, if we can provide that knowledge and skills, we want to move students into that area of expertise, which can show up depending on the talent area as early as late, middle school into high school, but more often into college and beyond, or career, when a student has achieved advanced targeted learning in their domain, and that's where mentorships and individual professional experiences become important. Now, we didn't put on the slide eminence, which is really sort of the final stage, because not all individuals achieve, nor do they strive to achieve eminence, but we can sort of look at the whole talent development model as a lifelong learning approach. So this isn't a linear process, but these are the stages that emerge when we're typically working with our students K-12. So we start with sort of that identification of talent and learning needs. And the question is, how do we make sure we identify students' learning needs, particularly students with exceptional ability or advanced learning needs? And there are some best practices that we're going to highlight today in the presentation. We're also going to talk about some of the most significant problems we need to avoid. And that's the most significant one is really under-identification of achievement and abilities. Now, in an hour, we're not going to be able to dig deeply into each of these pieces, but we hope that you'll sort of be thinking about ideas that you can bring back and dig into a little bit further. So one of the first pieces we need to start with is, what are we identifying and for what purpose? So when we start with identification of what, we're talking about a few different things: potential, or what we might call ability, and performance, or what we would call achievement. And we need to be looking in different domains. So maybe math, maybe reading, maybe science, art. So each domain might be a little bit different. We then need to look at instructional needs. So not just the ability and the achievement, but then what are the instructional needs behind that? And finally, where are students psychosocially? Where is their development? What do they need in order to maximize their potential or their performance? So all of those things are important to look at, but we have to agree that it's a waste of time to identify knowledge, skills, and abilities that we don't intend to do anything about. There's some things that schools can do and other things that schools cannot do. So the approach might be to do what we can in school and connect students to things outside of school that will help them in domains that we don't manage directly or that go beyond what we can do. So ideally, we want to identify students who need instruction or intervention that goes beyond what's typically provided at a grade level. And we have to consider in what domains we're able to provide those services. In the state of Illinois, when we talk about gifted programs, it specifically mentions language arts and mathematics. There are other domains. Schools may be able to address those, but we have to decide what services we can provide. And then we need tools to help us reveal these exceptional potential for learning or that ability, as well as measure current levels of achievement. And students, as we know, can excel in one or more areas. In the context of school, of course, we're focused on instructional needs for enrichment, for acceleration, in their domains of talent, understanding that some services will be provided in school, while others may have to come through supplemental services, weekends, or after school, or in the summer. And in addition to these, the intellectual ability and the academic skills and knowledge that we want to develop, we do have to pay attention to students' psychosocial skills, the behaviors that promote achievement and help students move through their talent development. So we also have to look at identification for what, and that's the what's happening in our schools, because any identification we do should match a set of services that we're going to provide and meet a student's educational needs and support their long-term talent development. So if we're going to measure students' achievement and abilities in various domains, then the data should help us do three things: place students in appropriate programming, like an advanced math class or a compacted science unit, meet students where they are, being mindful of barriers that may mask students' demonstrations of ability and achievement. Our students who also have identified learning disabilities, students who speak English as an additional language, how are we helping them demonstrate what they know? And finally, using tools that minimize bias and look at data in ways that promote inclusion rather than exclusion. So I will really caution against gatekeepers and obstacles that really that keep students from showing what they can do. For instance, if we base services only on teacher referrals, that can result in inconsistencies in who is identified. Teachers have different experiences or understandings of what they're looking for, and that can create some inconsistencies. High cut scores and standardized tests exclude many students who could benefit from advanced instruction. We know that nonverbal tests can help pinpoint a broader range of abilities, but they don't really help teachers plan their math instruction, for example. So to think about these different tools and pieces that we're using and for what are we using them. Okay, so on this slide, we sort of see the multi-tiered system of support, or the RTI model. And we already tier our approach to identifying the needs of students who are coming in below grade level standards. And we can do the same for students who are exceeding grade level standards and who are ready to progress more quickly through the grade level programming. And it's important to ask, how are we able to identify students in need of Tier 1 services, which are those that are typically taken care of in the regular classroom, perhaps with some support, and students who may need more individual or small group services, and students who need very intensive individualized interventions. And the answer is to use a variety of tools and data sets, things that you're already likely to be using in your school setting. So if we look at grade level tests of achievement, we might be talking about MAP tests and STAR tests and Ames Web, things like that. If we have tools that we're using, we can use them for our advanced learners to a certain extent. We can use grade level tests of ability. Some of you may be using the COGAT, Cognitive Abilities Test, an OLSAT or something like that. But it's also important to look at classroom performance, students' grades, their formal and informal classroom assessments, the work products that they have, and of course, teachers are excellent observers, as are others in your building. Students observing interactions with each other, or teachers observing interactions with students in class, at lunch, at recess, any times where you can sort of see what students are able to do. And ultimately, we can also use above grade level assessments. And those can be created or informally within a school district, but there are also programs that are nationwide, much like we have here at the Center for Talent Development, and Melissa will speak to in a few minutes. When we think about identification processes, there's typically some sort of screening level, there's then a match with services, and then we may need to gather additional data if necessary. And the traditional approach to gifted education has been to find what we would call a talent pool, and then select a particular group of students from that talent pool for a gifted program. That model, in that strictly structured way, is pretty outdated, and it doesn't really reflect what we know about talent development and the nature of students' learning needs. So if we're working with a multi-tiered system of support, and we're cultivating abilities as well as achievement, we're going to have layers of service and broader approaches to identifying abilities. So that in that traditional model that starts with the referral or nomination stage, we want to move away from that and advocate instead for universal screening and ongoing identification using multiple methods, using those different pieces that I mentioned on the last slide. If we screen all of our students, we can start matching to services immediately. And those students for whom we need to gather additional data about Tier 2 or Tier 3 services, we can do that along the way and add additional services as we learn more. And in the end, our identification approach and our tools should do at least three things. Find all the students that it should find who could benefit from a particular service or set of services, so that's alignment. And it should minimize the amount of testing that's necessary. And we want to proactively address under-identification, which is what I want to move to next. One of the big issues is unequal access. There are many effective and defensible ways to identify students' abilities and learning needs, but we're going to frame what we should do within the most prevalent or sort of pernicious problem that we run up against, which is unequal access. The good news is that we have a number of effective solutions, and these solutions are to start high-quality programming early, to front-load intensive enrichment experiences for all students, and increase rigor for all of our students in our classrooms, and provide scaffolding and supports up so that students can reach those higher level goals. We also really need to be thoughtful about how we're informing students and parents about the opportunities that they have and the resources that are available. So let's start to unpack some of these approaches a bit. You'll see here enrichment for all, and creative and critical problem solving for all, and a responsiveness to demonstrated abilities and needs. We know that students come to school very young, and that a significant factor in talent development is opportunity to learn. So elementary school is where achievement gaps and excellence gaps are at their smallest, and we have the strongest opportunity for impact. So, though we don't need to label our students early, we do need to implement best practices and respond to learning needs and differences right away. And so to address unequal opportunity to learn, and to learn more about students' ability to handle complex ideas and material, we have to connect students with fast-paced, in-depth enrichment programming. These programs can be built within the school system or done in partnerships with organizations like the Center for Talent Development or local libraries or museums. And it sort of goes against the grain. So instead of slowing learning down for students, we really want to think about how we can accelerate their learning opportunities and introduce that rigor as early as possible so that they can show us what they can do. And when educators see that evidence of advanced academic potential, the response needs to be more opportunities for depth, complexity, and accelerated learning. You know, there's a lot of conversation about genius hours and enrichment clusters in classrooms and things like that. All of those opportunities are good for all students, and it's a great way to learn more about what our students can do. So we can figure out ways that specialists can work more closely and collaboratively with pre-K to grade through classroom teachers on identifying needs and extending grade level work. So we also want to pay attention to enrichment for students who are on the cusp of above grade level programming. We can use materials designed for, so-called gifted learners and teach up with supports as frequently as possible. We really, as teachers, have to think about not letting executive functioning or school skills limit students' access to advanced curriculum. We want to teach those skills deliberately in the context of advanced content. We want to pay attention to growth targets for students in lower performing schools, in particular in populations that are typically overlooked, and seek to advance or accelerate the students early in these schools when they are outperforming their peers who have the same level of experience or background. So for students who are already mastering grade level skills and content knowledge, we want to allow for different forms of acceleration, thinking early about subject area acceleration when needed and compacting instruction when they already know the materials to be taught, and being prepared to use testing, whether it's achievement testing or ability testing at earlier ages, if the behaviors and performance warrant it. And of course, in the state of Illinois, schools and districts have to have an acceleration policy and a referral policy for early testing if all students do not begin until, the gifted programming does not, or testing doesn't begin until later grades. And of course, ultimately, we need an appeals process and an exit policy. One really simple but sometimes overlooked issue is informing and educate parents, or providing them with the information they need to develop their child's talents. The parents that we talk to often ask a lot about achievement and ability. They want to understand their students' test data, the performance measures being used in school, how talent develops, the resources and materials they can use at home. And so we've talked with schools a lot about it's not really up to us to decide what families can or cannot afford or handle when it comes to supplemental programming or outside of school, but more our job is to share the information and help direct them to people who can answer their questions and support their participation. In fact, asking what do you do to help students seek out financial aid or scholarships for supplemental programming, and who can complete applications and serve as a liaison to the program if parents need support. But as much information as we can send home with parents and help them ask good questions at home and direct them to outside programming, the better off they'll be. The second big issue is related to under-identification itself. So even when we know there are students who need interventions and exceptional potential, their students are not being identified appropriately for the services. And there isn't a magic solution, but we do know that there are some methods that are more effective than are currently practiced in many schools and districts. And the first is universal screening. As I said before, when at all possible, screen all students in both the achievement measures and ability. And if you can't afford that or you can't make that happen, screen as many students as you can. And we're talking about not starting with a referral process, but instead looking at the data you have and at least pulling in 25 to 30% of your population. You want to lower the threshold for that first phase of identification if we're looking at that multi-tiered system. And make sure that the skills that are measured in the first and second phase of any kind of tiered service providing, that those instruments are strongly related to each other and to the programming that's going to be available. For each type of service that you provide, for example, like a self-contained or an accelerated class, determine what level of knowledge and skill is really required to be successful in that programming, and what supports could be provided if a student isn't quite at the determined knowledge and skill level. If a child could benefit and really wouldn't be harmed, and I think we have to think about what harmed means, there's no reason to have strict entry for criteria. This would be true for many enrichment type activities. We have seen cases where schools have a pretty stringent criteria for entrance into what is ultimately an enrichment program. there doesn't seem to be a need for that. So more intensive, faster-paced learning environments probably do need specific levels of knowledge and skill, and that's where criteria can come into play. But what criteria and evidence of meeting that criteria must be carefully considered and to be as inclusive as possible. So after universal screening, the companion is local norms. So unless a program or service that you have serves a national audience, there really shouldn't be a need for national norms to be used. And when you're screening and making decisions about services needed, focus on local norms. Why local? Well, the norms for demographically similar groups from within your learning environment will give you a comparison with students who have more equal opportunity to learn. And really, we're asking, what do our students need in this educational setting? So identifying students who are already performing at or above the level of skill and content we're providing in our classroom environment. They may not be in the top 5% nationally, but they still need different instruction than other students in their class at school. And so in terms of putting local norms in practice, we want to compare student scores to those of other students in the school or the district who are similar in age, experience, and environment. That's critical. And in large districts, this may mean that some buildings have students with very, very different needs and therefore very, very different programming provided. So use norms for your school or district, and if that district is large and heterogeneous, try to use school norms. And be prepared to offer different programming for students with different levels of achievement and readiness. And be prepared to provide scaffolding and intensive interventions to develop knowledge and skills. You have to think differently about advanced programming. In a school where students are overall struggling to meet grade level expectations, students who are above the threshold really stand out. So what is in place to meet their needs? We have to have data, structures, and resources to accelerate their learning and get their needs met. And some of our lower performing schools may need the most intensive and expansive interventions, particularly if we want to counteract the effects of opportunity to learn and increase the dose of supplemental enrichment, which we know is pivotal for high levels of talent development. So if we have students who are sort of on the cusp, we intervene very early, and if they're going to move on to middle school and high school, so they're prepared for more accelerated learning opportunities there. In addition to local norms, we want to think about allowing for multiple means of entry into a set of programs or services. And unfortunately, many schools use very intricate matrices that weigh test scores and try to compare work products or recommendations. And this is usually too restrictive. It often doesn't align results with the services being provided. And it can eliminate a lot of students who could be successful in the programming. So instead, we want to focus on how do we create learning profiles and focus more on what the preponderance of evidence tells us about a student's readiness. And if we're in a situation where we find more students in our program can accommodate, like in a self-contained class, and you're confident that the majority of the students identified will be successful, then you really need to step back and evaluate your curriculum and instruction for all students. And it's likely that the rigor and level of instruction needs to be increased for a larger pool of students, if not all of your students. So in terms of recommendations, we want to coordinate pre-K through grade 12 plan for talent screening and for placement and services in each domain of programming. And then we want to regularly and systematically evaluate student growth against appropriate targets. Which brings us to programming. So, like when we design tiered programs and services for students who are not yet meeting grade level expectations, we're talking about doing the same for above grade level students. And the best practice is a continuum of services that uses what we call a level of service model. And this sounds kind of daunting and expensive, but it really doesn't have to be. Much of what's needed is already available in schools with a creative thinking and willingness to be flexible. So we start with a conceptual framework. We go back to that optimal match. We can't really individualize instruction necessarily, but there is a strong drive in education to make it personalized and meaningful in the way that we group for and support instruction and the choices that we provide our students and the curriculum that we use in our instructional methods. So for advanced students, we can really look at two thought leaders, Vygotsky and Csikszentmihalyi. And Vygotsky's talking about promoting cognitive development rather than providing experiences at the current level of maturity. So if we keep doing the same thing over and over, something we're good at, we're not going to learn anything new. We have to be in that challenge zone. And Csikszentmihalyi talks about helping students achieve flow. and they're in that range where they have to work to achieve. And when they're in that mode, they're working hard, time passes quickly, they're moving ahead. So we want to think about creating that optimal environment in that way, which means our programming for talent development consists of two pieces: appropriate challenge, which includes advanced enrichment and acceleration, and then support, that psychosocial skill development that students need to reach their full potential. So we go back to our MTSF in our RTI conversion, and that when we're thinking about delivery of services, the tiered model suggests that Tier 1 services are planned and delivered by the general classroom teacher with some grouping in class, some differentiated instruction, and as needs become more specific, the delivery and planning move toward a more specialized approach. That's what we call a continuum of services, which is defined by Tamara Stambaugh of Vanderbilt University. A horizontal continuum of services is multiple options or levels of service dependent on the needs of the students identified. Horizontal represents options available within a particular grade level, so sort of the range of things that are happening in 4th grade or 3rd grade, for example. Now, some students in that grade may be getting in-class options, others may have a pull-out, or they may be in a self-contained class, depending on what their needs are. The vertical continuum simply means offering a range of options at all the different grade levels in your school system. When we talk about levels of service, there's a particular model from Selby and Young where we talk about four different levels. So we can go 3 or 4 levels of service, but level 1 services are open to all of the students. They're critical and creative thinking strategies, design thinking, enrichment that are embedded in lessons in all of our different subject areas. And from that, we can identify and nurture gifted potential in our young students. When we move into level 2, differentiated lessons give students who are starting to show us more advancement or potential in areas of specific academic strength. A little bit more intensive services. We might have a resource teacher collaborating with a classroom teacher. Level 3 services, those are students who have been identified by a more intensive screening process. Those may be talking about more accelerated classes and advanced classes and more direct instruction in their area of strength. Level 4 would be most extreme then. Those students are well above grade level and need very specific interventions with a small number of students. So it might break down something like what you're seeing on the screen right now. We might have cluster grouping in a classroom, curriculum compacting in the classroom for a Tier 1 service, but we're also talking about enrichment for all students. In the Tier 2, you may see, even at the high school level, we're talking about sometimes advanced classes or AP classes, mentorships come into the mix with older students. And then Tier 3 services. There are lots of different ways to do this based on what your resources are and what your students' needs are. And then in terms of level of service, there are 5 pieces to this. Remaining flexible, many different people and places and kinds of activities. It doesn't follow one formula or set curriculum. It's inclusive. We're looking for ways for all students to develop their skills and abilities and show us where their talents are. It's responsive to the needs of the students that are present, and that we're looking to reveal abilities through the activities we're providing. It's proactive. We're really challenging everybody to take initiative for talent development. Everybody is responsible for that. And it's unifying. Programming provides a structure and a language for communicating across our whole system. And finally, we get into some non-negotiables for advanced learners. When it comes to services, there are components that they have to be there. And those are accelerated study. We're talking about accelerated content, accelerated pacing, accelerated placement, enrichment, flexible grouping to allow for differentiated curriculum, differentiated instruction, and differentiated assessment, and access to supplemental opportunities. These are all effective, proven approaches that support advanced learners. And in fact, acceleration is the most researched and most highly effective approach in its many different forms. So ultimately, differentiation and acceleration are the most effective for all students. And how do we do this? We're deliberate about creating our learning environment. We want to make sure a student's zone of proximal development falls within a teacher's zone of proximal possible differentiation, meaning a classroom of 30 has to be carefully put together because a teacher cannot do 30 different lesson plans. We have to be mindful of what's possible. If you're interested in an example of a robust, effective example of an advanced academic programming using a levels of service model, The Fairfax County, Virginia Public Schools website is something you should explore. Harold Horn established the program over a decade ago, and it's continued to develop and evolve, and it makes use of universal screening, local norms, the continuum of service. There are other wonderful programs out there in the world. This website happens to be very, very robust, and it has a lot of examples and information. So it's just a good resource for you to take a look at if you are interested in learning more about how this might look or work. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa to talk a little bit about assessment.
Sure. Thanks, Susan. So we've been through kind of a little bit of assessment pieces dealing with identification, and we're mostly going to focus here on measurement of learning, talking about measuring achievement, to understand mastery or readiness for learning, and then measuring growth to ensure movement in acquisition of skills and knowledge across our pathway of standards. Oftentimes being advanced is not an indication of growth in our systems. Sometimes students come to us advanced. So you have to pick up what we're doing at that point with them. Also, maintaining status can't always be a substitution for growth. We have a lot of high achieving students that are achieving in normative percentiles at the 99th percentile. And those students, if they maintain status, may in fact not be growing. So we have to be aware of those pitfalls when we're talking about measuring achievement and growth for our highest ability learners in our system. One thing I want to chat about a little bit is proficiency assessment is really popular in education conversations today. And in this specific example, we're looking at grade level IAR results. And this might be what a distribution of a regular class would look like. But what I want to focus on are our students over here in category 5. We know that these students have likely mastered a lot of grade level material, but it tells us too little about what they may have mastered beyond the grade level where they're placed, or what they're ready to learn beyond grade level content and standards. So in this example, our students are only compared to same age peers who are all exposed to the same grade level aligned material. In an example like this, where we take a look at the limitations of national percentile comparisons, if we take a deeper look at only those students who are 5s on our IAR test, and then we pull them into a data set like this, those students on that previous slide, they may look like this when we look at them against national percentile comparisons. Even here, we see great variance in the ability and learning exhibited here. Some of our students are scoring at the 99th percentile, and some are scoring below the 90th percentile, even though they're all at the top end of the range. In this data set, all of these students here have qualified for gifted or talented services and are receiving the same level of service inside of their system. These grade level normative comparisons don't tell us the whole story of the varied learning needs of these identified students. So how can we go about taking a look at these students differently? Different from the way they look on proficiency assessment, and differently than they look in our benchmark or normative assessments that we have already in our school system. In this example, what we've done is we've taken that exact same group of students from the previous slide, and we measured them above grade level on the PSAT. And in this example, this is an actual cohort of students that we've done work with. So the students from the slides before are indeed these same students that we're looking at now on a different distribution. Measuring above grade level allows for students to demonstrate learning above the traditional ceilings of grade level content and selected services. And this data set here includes scores on the PSAT that are above grade level for these 5th graders. So even when students meet similar criteria on identification assessments, grade level mastery assessments, and benchmark assessments, measuring further provides information that all of these students are not ready for the same instruction or level of programming. This normative distribution compares high-achieving 5th graders only to other high-achieving 5th graders across the country who also took the PSAT. This gives us information related to varied learning needs. The students in the highest percentiles here, who are outperforming even their talented same grade peers, need different placements in programming than those who are in the middle or lower percentiles here. So how are these scores useful inside of our school systems? Students who participate in above grade level assessment here at CTD get reporting that shows scale scores, both for composite combined totals and for sub-goal areas on the PSAT, or for older students, SAT and ACT, as well as new corresponding percentiles that compare them only to other high achievers. In this specific example, we can see that this specific student is very talented across the board, but is more exceptional in the areas of reading and science. This type of asynchronous talent exists in many of our high-achieving students, and is valuable information when we're programming or selecting services for them. Also here are resources such as our new MAPS User Family Guide. It supports understanding of scores, percentiles, learning statements, and program guidance. While numbers and scores are important, what we're going to do with those numbers and scores provides us a little more substance. So if we have the ability to know what scale scores are, we can broaden that lookout, and we can take a look at what learning statements are connected to those scale scores. A benefit for us for using the PSAT is that College Board has created a continuum of statements that are aligned to PSAT and SAT scale scores and college and career standards. Statements in a student's academic skills pathway, that indicates readiness for instruction and progression of skills and standards that come next. And these statements can be used to inform instruction or drive formative or summative assessment in the classroom. We're really excited at CTD because we've been doing some growth modeling with our high achieving students. It's great to know that they are achieving above grade level, but we also want to know, are they growing in their placements that might be above grade level as well? So CTD has partnered with the EPIR group to create a growth model to better understand how students move and improve on the PSAT, SAT, and ACT when taken from year to year. This growth helps us better understand the effective programming as well as pace and depth of which students are acquiring skills and mastering new content. Growth data on these assessments provides a different look at growth other than mainstream assessments that are typically used in our school database systems. In this plot here, the highlighted gray box provides the student scale scores, both for the first administration and the second administration of the test, the projected average growth, and a growth percentile that compares their growth to average growth. This particular student had a projected score of 712 and actually scored a 720. So their growth is in the 57th percentile, which is slightly better than average. This gives us a really good look at how this student is performing based on the instruction and programming that they're exposed to in their school system. So this type of data is very valuable when we try to answer the following questions. Number one, what are our high achievers growing? And number two, are they growing enough? Are they growing at or better than average projections when we compare them to other high-achieving students? Number three, how effective is our programming? And number four, are we still under programming for some of our high-ability students? 6, have we programmed students that need more support? And that's an important one. In this plot, we see any student that's below that bottom blue line not keeping up with their peers with average growth, and we want to know if we've placed them into some kind of program, how do we support them and make them successful? And as your data helps bring context to your identification and programming work, we also encourage you to better understand gifted programming standards. So you can find the newest gifted programming standards at the NAGC for pre-K through grade 12 for gifted programming standards. They were first initially brought on board in 1998, and they have recently been updated in November of 2019. There are 6 standards that you'll find related to gifted programming. They're learning and development, assessment, curriculum and instruction, learning environments, programming, and professional learning. The standards are available for download on the National Association for Gifted Children website, nagc.org, and are a great tool for both designing and evaluating programs and services. Okay. So Arlen, this brings us to our question and answer portion of the webinar. Do we have any questions that are out there?
We had an initial question come through about the possibility of getting a copy of the PowerPoint. Would we be able to get maybe a PDF version of this to share out with the recording?
Sure, yeah, absolutely, we can do that.
Okay, great. And then, of course, feel free to type in any questions into the questions box as a participant, and we'll make sure to address those. One question that's come in is, when should you start assessing young learners?
Okay, here we go. Melissa, you want to take this first?
I think when you start assessing young learners depends on what your school academic profile looks like, what your students look like when they come to you. Certainly, some students are ready for assessment before others, but we advocate most often for that universal exposure model of when students come in young to us, we want to expose everybody to rich enrichment activities. And depending on your school system's population and what that academic profile looks like, you may be ready to assess earlier than later, but we definitely want to make sure that we've had enough time and enough opportunity to expose students to those experiences before we start formally assessing them.
I would also say if we start to see if the school doesn't typically start testing all students until grade 2 or 3, we want to be thoughtful about, okay, is that the right time in our system? But also, if there are individual students who are starting to demonstrate advanced learning needs, an assessment early on is a good thing to do, to know exactly where they are and how then to adjust our programming. But that will also mean thinking about what do these students know about assessment or testing, and what do we have to do to prepare them for that assessment. We test, students as young as 4 on a MAP test, but that means they have to understand what that test is all about, how to use the technology involved, what these questions will look like. So there's preparation involved in that.
All right, very good. Another question that's come in: when looking at above grade level testing, besides the new mats, what else can we do to accelerate grade or subject area?
As far as assessment's concerned?
Judy,
so
can you clarify that? Yes, she said yes.
Yeah, there's a really great tool out there called the Iowa Acceleration Scale. And it is a step-by-step process that helps you use the data that you already have inside of your system, and it walks you through that process of evaluating the student and what you know about that student in best practice for considering acceleration. So if, other than above grade level assessment, the Iowa Acceleration Scale is an absolutely great tool to use if you're going to engage in the process of considering accelerating students, whether it's whole grade or single subject acceleration.
Mm-hmm. And the UMass testing that we do is part of a national program. However, within a school system, depending on what kind of resources you have there and the folks you have for providing support with data, you can use other tests that you have above grade level, but you'll have to think about what do those norms look like, how do you develop those over time. It's just a little bit more involved process, but it certainly can be done.
All right, very good. Another question here: do you suggest using assessments to assist with compacting curriculum for those students who may exhibit talent or gifted area in the core subjects?
Yes, definitely. And there are a lot of assessments you can use. If you have a really good, strong interim assessment, that could be used as a starting point. That interim assessment can drive formative and summative evaluation in the classroom to ensure that those students have mastered skills at a level that you would be comfortable with if you're considering compacting and moving forward. And something really important to remember is that students don't have to have 100% on everything to be ready to be moved through and compacted through curriculum. They don't have to be perfect. They just have to be ready to move.
Mm-hmm. And there's the difference between compacting an entire grade level of content and compacting unit to unit in a classroom, right? So you'll be looking at either the data that you have, that's more formal or more standardized, but in the classroom, if you're talking about units and planning ahead, you of course be looking at more informal assessments, pre-assessments with the teacher.
All right, thanks to you both. Susan and Melissa, really appreciate you spending this hour with us and sharing all this great information. Appreciate our participants who logged in and caught the webinar live. It was recorded, and I will be sending out a link to the recording as well as a link to download the PowerPoint in PDF format and an evaluation form that once complete will give you an evidence of completion form so you can use this for professional development clock hours. Another question just popped in here. We've got time for one more or a couple more if you think of them. This one's from Matthew. How can I best support my teachers and staff in learning about curriculum compacting and how to do it?
That's a really good question. You know, I think we would love to say there's sort of a easy list of people you can just call to do that. There are some good resources out there just in terms of if you want to do some learning groups within your school system, you know, teachers working together. If you've got a couple of experts, you know, on your team already, pulling them together in just sort of those more informal learning groups and trying things out together, it's a great way to do that. Otherwise, you can certainly get in touch with us about specific, you know, resources or people that we know about that do professional development, but really the more homegrown it can be, there are probably some fabulous folks who are already in your system who are doing this that can be brought in to do a more long-term, you know, study group. But you can let us know if we can help with specific recommendations of books or materials and or people who do the PD in that area. But I think encouraging them to try these things out, and it doesn't have to be perfect the first time, or to put something together and run it by someone like us in the center to say, does this look like what we should be doing? Even that's enough to get the ball rolling.
All right, very good. I don't see any other questions coming into the questions box. I'm going to stop the recording, and our participants are free to close the GoToWebinar control panel, and that will log you out of the session today. Thank you once again, everybody, for your participation. I hope you have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.